They told him he had 15 hours to live. 15 hours under the Emperor's gaze before the war devoured him. Harvin Lorne, 17, a boy from a sunlit farm, stepped into the shadow of Brcher Rock, unaware that hope itself was a luxury the Imperium did not afford. Around him, the trenches yawned like graves, and the sky burned a sickly red. The first blast of the ork guns tore the world apart, and in that instant, he understood. Here, survival was a miracle, and death, the only certainty. Time moves differently when you know you're going to die. The Departamento Munitorum's statistics are carved into every guardsman's mind like a scar that never heals. 15 hours. That's how long the average Imperial Guard soldier survives their first deployment in an active war zone. Not 15 days. Not 15 weeks. 15 hours. Barely enough time to watch the sun rise twice before the Emperor calls you home. Arvin L., that's all the name the Imperium bothered to record, stood at 17 years old on the embarkation deck of the Throne's Wrath, clutching his standard-issue laser gun with hands that had never held anything more dangerous than a farming scythe. The irony would have been beautiful if it weren't so absolutely, devastatingly cruel. Here was a boy who had spent his entire life coaxing life from barren soil, now shipped across the void to become fertilizer for some forgotten rock in the galactic periphery. The smell hit him first. 10,000 bodies packed into recycled air. The metallic tang of fear sweat mixing with sacred incense and machine oil. Around him, other fresh-faced recruits tried to look like the veterans they'd never become, adjusting flak armor that felt foreign against skin that had known only rough-spun cloth. Some prayed to the Emperor. Others stared into the middle distance, already practicing the 1,000-yard stare that defined those who'd seen too much. But Arvin was different. Not special. The 41st Millennium had no patience for special. Different in the way that only the truly naive can be, carrying something that the grinding machinery of the Imperium hadn't yet managed to crush. Hope. It glowed in his dark eyes like a candle flame in a hurricane, flickering but persistent, completely unaware that the storm was already upon him. The Vox speakers crackled to life with a sound like breaking bones. All personnel, prepare for warp translation. The Emperor protects. The mechanical voice carried no warmth, no comfort, just the cold certainty of duty. Arvin felt his stomach lurch as reality bent around them, dragging 10,000 souls through the screaming chaos of the immaterium toward a destination that most of them couldn't even pronounce. Brcher Rock. A world that existed solely to bleed and die upon, where the statistical 15 hours wasn't just a number, it was an optimistic estimate. The older soldiers, those scarred few who'd somehow cheated death long enough to earn their second deployment, watched the fresh meat with expressions caught between pity and envy. They remembered what it felt like to believe in tomorrow. They remembered when the Emperor's light seemed like more than just the distant gleam of a dying star. Most of all, they remembered not knowing what was waiting in the darkness between the stars, hungry and patient and absolutely without mercy. As the transport shuddered through the immaterium, Arvin closed his eyes and thought of home. Golden wheat swaying in summer winds. His mother's voice calling him in for dinner. The simple weight of honest exhaustion after a day's work under a sun that had never known the shadow of orbital bombardment. He held these memories close, not knowing they would soon become his only defense against the madness that was coming. The Emperor's clock had already started ticking. 4 standard months earlier, Arvin had been ankle-deep in the muddy fields of Agri-World Helios 7. His biggest concern the price of grain futures and whether the harvest would be sufficient to meet the tithe. The sky had been blue then, not the poisonous amber of a war-torn atmosphere, but honest blue, the color of hope and infinite possibility. The Departamento Munitorum had arrived on a Tuesday. They came in black transports that settled onto the village square like carrion birds, disgorging officers whose pressed uniforms had never known the kiss of honest dirt. The conscription order was read from a data slate, each name pronounced with the mechanical precision of a funeral rite. Arvin L., age 17. Physical condition, adequate. Mental state, malleable. Destination, Cadia, for immediate combat training and subsequent deployment to active war zone designation, Brcher Rock. His mother had wept. His father had stood silent, jaw clenched, hands that had fought in the Helios compliance 40 years prior, trembling with the memory of his own service. They knew, as all Imperial citizens knew, that when the Imperium called, you answered. The alternative was a heretic's death for the entire family. Cadia had been a revelation of purposeful brutality. The fortress world squatted in the void like a clenched fist, its surface carved into endless training grounds where human endurance was tested against the relentless demands of total war. Here, beneath skies that flickered with the unnatural aurora of the Eye of Terror, farm boys and hive-worlders and void-born brats were broken down and rebuilt into the finest fighting force in human history. The first month had been physical conditioning that redefined Arvin's understanding of exhaustion. 5-kilometer runs in full kit, while drill sergeants screamed litanies of hatred. Obstacle courses designed by sadists who understood that the only preparation for hell was to live there first. Combat drills with live ammunition, because the dead couldn't learn from their mistakes, and the Imperium had no patience for soldiers who flinched at the sound of battle. Arvin's hands, soft from years of grain handling, developed calluses that would never fade. His body, lean from farm work but unprepared for war, hardened into something that could march for days and still fight when the enemy appeared. Most importantly, his mind, that soft civilian mind that still believed in fairness and justice and the possibility of going home, was systematically disassembled and rebuilt according to Imperial doctrine. The indoctrination sessions came twice daily, delivered by commissars whose voices could strip paint from bulkheads. They spoke of duty and honor and the sacred burden of defending humanity from the darkness that pressed in from all sides. They painted vivid pictures of Xeno's horrors and the corruption of chaos, until every recruit understood that death in service to the Emperor was not just preferable to life under alien dominion. It was the only fate worth considering. By the second month, Arvin could field strip his laser gun blindfolded. By the third, he could put a last round through a target at 300 meters while under simulated artillery bombardment. By the fourth, he had learned to sleep standing up, eat rations that tasted like recycled cardboard, and find the rhythm that would carry him through whatever fresh hell awaited beyond Cadia's poisoned sky. The drill sergeants watched them all, these fresh-faced killers in training, and they saw the same thing they'd seen in 10,000 previous classes. Raw material for the Emperor's war machine. Some would be ground up in the gears, their names forgotten before their blood had dried. Others might last long enough to become the grizzled veterans who would train the next batch of doomed children. But they were ready now, these sons and daughters of a million worlds, ready to take their place in the endless line of heroes and martyrs that stretched back 10,000 years to the Emperor's first crusade. ready to die for an Imperium that would forget their names before their bodies cooled, in service to an ideal so vast and terrible that mortal minds could barely comprehend its scope. As the transport prepared for departure, Arvin L. stood in formation with 999 other souls, each one carrying their own burden of hope and fear and desperate determination. They were soldiers now, forged in the crucible of Cadia and tempered by the knowledge of their own expendability. The Emperor's work was never finished, and they were his willing instruments. 7 weeks in the belly of a troop transport teaches a man things that no amount of training can prepare him for. The throne's wrath had been designed by engineers who understood efficiency, but had never lived in the spaces they created. 2,000 souls, packed into berths, meant for half that number, breathing recycled air that tasted of metal and despair, counting the days until they could die properly under an open sky. Arvin had claimed a corner bunk in Section 7, Alpha, wedged between Corvash, a hive-worlder whose pale skin had never seen natural sunlight, and Tanis, whose Cadian accent marked him as one of the planet's countless orphaned sons. They'd formed the kind of friendship that only exists in the face of certain death, intense, desperate, and built on the shared understanding that none of them would live to see home again. The days blended together in a haze of weapon maintenance, physical conditioning, and the endless bureaucracy of military life. Morning prayers to the Emperor delivered through Vox speakers that crackled with static. Afternoon drills in corridors too narrow for proper formation work. Evening rations that claimed to be nutritious but tasted like punishment. And always, beneath it all, the steady throb of the ship's engines carrying them closer to their destiny. The veterans moved through this routine with the grim efficiency of men who'd done it all before. They knew which rations were least likely to cause digestive distress. They knew how to sleep through the ship's alarm klaxons and which junior officers could be trusted not to volunteer their squads for suicide missions. Most importantly, they knew how to maintain the delicate balance between hope and despair that kept a soldier functional in the face of overwhelming odds. But it was the stories that truly prepared the fresh meat for what was coming. Sergeant Holst, a scarred veteran of the Sabbat World's crusade, would hold court in the evenings after the lights dimmed to their nighttime setting. His voice, roughened by years of breathing weapons fire and chemical pollutants, painted pictures of battles that stretched across continents and wars that consumed entire systems. He spoke of orks that blackened the stars with their crude vessels, of tyrannid swarms that stripped worlds to bedrock, of chaos cultists whose corruption could spread through a regiment like a plague. Brcher Rock, he'd said one night, his augmetic eye glowing red in the dimness, is where the galaxy goes to die. Orks have been holding that rock for 3 standard years, and they're not holding it because they're pretty. They're holding it because every time we take it back, something worse shows up to take it from us. The strategists call it strategic significance. The soldiers call it hell with a postal code. The joke started around the 4th week, born from the desperate need to laugh at something, anything, in the face of statistical certainty. Someone had calculated that their transport carried enough fresh troops to last exactly 2 weeks on Brcher Rock, assuming the standard 15-hour survival rate. This became known as the Emperor's Vacation Package, 2 weeks of all-inclusive dying in a scenic war zone. Corvash developed a talent for impressions, mimicking the pompous tones of staff officers who'd never seen combat. Gentlemen, intelligence suggests that the enemy position is only lightly fortified with approximately 17 million orks and their entire extended family structure. The laughter that followed was sour and bitter, but it was laughter nonetheless. Tanis preferred gallows humor of a more practical sort. He'd taken to composing letters to his hypothetical widow, dictating them to anyone who'd listen. Dearest imaginary wife, I am writing to inform you that I have been tragically killed in a heroic fashion, probably involving an explosion and definitely involving poor tactical planning by someone with more rank than sense. But as the weeks passed and the ship's chronometer marked their steady approach to the Brcher system, even the jokes began to feel hollow. The weight of what was coming settled over them like a shroud, pressing down on conversations and dreams alike. They were no longer soldiers in training. They were ammunition in the Emperor's grand strategy, and ammunition was meant to be expended. The first sign that they were approaching their destination came through the ship's optical arrays. The void ahead no longer held the familiar patterns of distant stars, but instead showed the angry red glow of a system at war. Orbital debris glittered like deadly confetti, the remains of ships and stations that had already paid the ultimate price for this forgotten piece of rock. As Arvin stared out at the hellish vista through a scratched porthole, he felt something cold settle in his chest. Not fear. He'd moved beyond fear weeks ago. This was acceptance, pure and simple. He was going to die. They were all going to die. The only question was whether their deaths would buy the Imperium another day, another hour, another precious moment in its endless struggle against the darkness. The Emperor's clock was no longer counting down to their deployment. It was counting down to their deaths, and they could all hear it ticking. The drop pods screamed down through Brcher Rock's tortured atmosphere like metallic tears shed by an uncaring god. Arvin felt his stomach attempt to crawl out through his throat as the craft bucked and rolled, its hull glowing cherry red from atmospheric friction and enemy fire alike. Around him, 9 other soldiers sat strapped into their harnesses, faces pale behind the green glow of their helmet displays, lips moving in silent prayers to the Emperor and dead mothers and anyone else who might be listening. The first indication that their landing zone was compromised came in the form of an explosion that rattled every bolt in the pod's superstructure. Someone, Corvash maybe, though it was hard to tell with everyone's voice pitched high with adrenaline, screamed something that might have been a prayer or a curse. The difference ceased to matter when the pod's machine spirit announced in its emotionless tone, "Impact in 30 seconds. Prepare for combat deployment. 30 seconds." Arvin had spent longer deciding what to have for breakfast back on Helios 7. Now it was the difference between being a soldier and being a corpse. The impact drove his teeth into his tongue, hard enough to fill his mouth with the taste of copper and fear. Emergency lighting bathed everything in hellish red as the pod's sides blew outward with a series of shaped charges that had been calculated to provide maximum tactical advantage and minimum survival probability for anything standing too close. Fresh air, if you could call the chemical-tainted atmosphere of a world at war fresh, rushed in through the openings. What Arvin saw in those first precious seconds would haunt what remained of his dreams for the rest of his very short life. Brcher Rock had once been a mining world, its surface carved into geometric patterns by generations of excavation equipment. Now, it resembled nothing so much as the infected wound of a dying titan. The sky was the color of old blood, lit by the constant flash of artillery and the funeral pyres of burning vehicles. The air tasted of cordite and death, and something else. Something that made his genetically enhanced survival instincts scream warnings that his conscious mind couldn't quite process. But it was the sound that truly drove home the reality of where he'd landed. Not the constant thunder of heavy weapons, though that was there. Not the screaming of wounded men, though that formed a horrible counterpoint to the symphony of destruction. It was the roaring, a sound like a million throat opened in perpetual challenge, rolling across the battlefield like an audio tsunami of pure, distilled violence. The orks were coming. Arvin's training took over before his terror could paralyze him completely. Lays gun up, safety off, finger, finding the trigger as naturally as breathing. The other members of his squad, those who'd survived the landing, formed up around him with the mechanical precision that had been beaten into them on Cadia. 10 became 8, as they realized that Corvash and another soldier whose name Arvin couldn't remember had been reduced to component atoms by the explosion that had damaged their pod. "Move! Move! Move!" Sergeant Holst's voice cut through the chaos like a chains ward through flesh. The scarred veteran had somehow survived not only the drop, but also what appeared to be a direct hit from some kind of orc artillery. Half his face was a mask of blood, but he was still functional, still fighting, still doing his duty to the Emperor even as his life leaked out onto the poisoned ground. They ran. Not in any particular direction. Tactical doctrine became irrelevant when the enemy was everywhere and nowhere was safe. But toward the sound of Imperial weapons fire, toward the thin line of guardsmen who were supposedly holding this particular piece of hell against the green tide that sought to wash it clean of human life. The first orc that Arvin saw up close had been dead for several hours, its massive corpse sprawled across what might once have been a supply trench. Even in death, it was terrifying. 3 meters of muscle and scar tissue and crude bionics, armed with a weapon that looked like someone had welded a chainsaw to an artillery shell and added a trigger mechanism as an afterthought. Its tusked face was frozen in an expression of pure joy, the kind of happiness that came from finding the perfect fight and dying in it. "Don't stare at the dead ones," Tanis shouted over the sound of incoming mortar fire. "It's the live ones you need to worry about." As if summoned by his words, the trench line ahead of them erupted in las fire and screaming. Human screaming pitched high with pain and terror. And underneath it, the bass rumble of orc voices raised in what passed for their version of battle hymns. They were in the trenches now, the green tide having finally washed over another section of the Imperial line. Arvin watched a man die. Not the clean death of training scenarios or the noble sacrifice of propaganda reels, but the messy, arbitrary reality of a laser gun battery running dry at exactly the wrong moment. The guardsman, young, maybe even younger than Arvin, tried to reload while an orc the size of a small building bore down on him with a weapon that defied several laws of physics. The boy's hands shook as he fumbled with the battery pack. The orc's crude axe caught the last rays of the system's dying sun as it rose overhead. Arvin's first kill was an accident of timing and terror. He'd meant to fire at the orc threatening the young guardsman, but his hands were shaking and his aim was off, and the last round that left his weapon struck a fuel canister that some genius had left sitting in the open. The explosion took out the orc, the young soldier, and a section of trench that had taken a week to dig. He'd saved no one. He'd killed an ally along with the enemy, and somehow, impossibly, he was still alive. The battle raged around them for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Time became elastic in the face of overwhelming sensory input. The crack of las weapons, the thunder of orc guns, the wet sounds that human bodies made when subjected to forces they weren't designed to withstand. Arvin fired his weapon until the barrel was hot enough to burn through his gloves, then kept firing because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant accepting what was happening around him. When the orks finally fell back, not retreating, never retreating, just pausing to gather more of their kind for the next wave, Arvin found himself crouched in a shell crater next to 3 other soldiers he didn't recognize. His squad was gone. Sergeant Holst was gone. Even Tanis, who'd somehow survived everything from the drop to the first assault, had vanished somewhere in the chaos of the last hour. One of the soldiers, a woman, whose flak armor was painted with the kind of kill marks that spoke of improbable survival, looked at her chronometer and laughed. It was not a pleasant sound. "Congratulations, fresh meat," she said, her voice hoarse from shouting orders that no one could hear. "You've been on Brcher Rock for exactly 14 hours and 53 minutes. 7 more minutes and you'll have beaten the odds." Arvin stared at her, his mind trying to process the information. 14 hours and 53 minutes. He'd lived through nearly 15 hours of the worst fighting in the known galaxy. He was about to become a statistical anomaly, one of the precious few who survived longer than the Departamento Munitorum's grim calculations suggested. The Emperor's clock was still ticking, but for the first time since he'd left Helios 7, Arvin dared to believe that he might hear it tick again. The trenches of Brcher Rock existed in a state of organized chaos that would have impressed the architects of hell. What had begun as proper Imperial fortifications, neat lines of fire positions and communication trenches laid out according to the sacred principles of the Tactica Imperialis, had been modified by months of constant warfare into something that resembled the digestive system of a dying god. Arvin followed Sergeant Vex, the kill-marked woman who'd become his de facto commander, through a maze of interconnected holes that served as the front line of humanity's latest desperate stand. She moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned to navigate a battlefield in her sleep, stepping over unexploded ordnance and the occasional body part with equal indifference. "First rule of trench warfare," she called back to him as they descended into a section that smelled strongly of unwashed humanity and chemical sanitizer, "is that there are no rules. Everything you learned on Cadia about proper fire discipline and coordinated advances, forget it. This is about survival, pure and simple. The Emperor judges results, not methods." The bunker that served as their temporary headquarters had been carved from the living rock by successive waves of desperate defenders. Its walls were lined with ammunition crates that doubled as furniture, and its floor was carpeted with a layer of mud that had been mixed with enough human blood to qualify as a reliquary. A dozen soldiers occupied the space, their faces showing the telltale signs of extended combat. The 1,000-yard stare, the nervous tics, the way they flinched at sounds that wouldn't have bothered them a week ago. "Fresh meat," announced Vex to the assembled troops. "Meet the 47th Mordian Iron Guard, 3rd Company, 2nd Platoon, what's left of the 1st Squad. Gentlemen, meet our newest statistical anomaly. He's been breathing for 16 hours and counting." The soldiers looked up from their various activities: weapon maintenance, letter writing, the kind of small rituals that helped maintain sanity in an insane world, and nodded with the professional interest of artisans examining a new tool. One of them, a thin man whose augmetic arm whirred softly as he cleaned his laser gun, spoke up in the clipped accent of a Mordian drill sergeant. 16 hours? Emperor's blood, boy, you're practically a veteran. Tell me, what's your secret? Lucky charm? Blessed ammunition? Deal with the demon?" Arvin realized they were serious. 16 hours of survival made him an expert by local standards. The thought should have been terrifying, but exhaustion had moved him beyond terror into a state of numb acceptance. "I don't know," he said honestly. I just kept my head down and tried not to die. Solid tactical doctrine, observed another soldier, this one sporting the kind of facial scars that spoke of intimate acquaintance with orc weapons. Simple, practical, effective. I like him already. The next few hours passed in a blur of indoctrination into the realities of siege warfare. Arvin learned to recognize the difference between incoming and outgoing artillery by the sound alone. He learned to time his movements to the rhythm of enemy sniper fire and to identify which sections of trench were most likely to collapse during the next bombardment. Most importantly, he learned the unwritten rules that governed life in the trenches. Never volunteer for anything. The officers had plenty of ways to get you killed without your active participation. Always carry more ammunition than food. You could eat an orc's rations if you killed him, but his ammunition wouldn't fit your weapon. Sleep whenever possible, wherever possible, however possible. Exhausted soldiers made mistakes, and mistakes got everyone killed. Trust your squad mates with your life, but never with your rations, your ammunition, or your lucky charm. The orcs attacked again at what the chronometer claimed was 2,100 hours local time. Arvin had been on Brcher Rock for 22 hours and had officially entered uncharted statistical territory. The Departamento Munitorum had no data on soldiers who survived longer than a day in this particular hell, which meant he was now operating without the comfort of even grim predictions about his lifespan. This assault was different from the chaotic melee of his first battle. The orcs had learned from their previous failures and were applying something that almost resembled tactical thinking to the problem of killing every human on the planet. They came in waves, each one designed to probe a different weakness in the Imperial line, testing for the critical failure point that would allow them to pour through and finish what they'd started. Arvin found himself assigned to a heavy bolter team, feeding ammunition belts to a weapon that had been blessed by 3 different tech priests and still jammed every 50 rounds. The gunner, a woman named Kovar, whose arms were so heavily tattooed with protective wards that she looked like a walking illuminated manuscript, maintained a steady stream of profanity that would have impressed a chaos cultist. "Feed me another belt, farm boy," she shouted over the sound of her weapon chewing through orc flesh and bone with equal enthusiasm. "These green bastards don't kill themselves. More's the pity." Every minute he lived was borrowed time, stolen from the jaws of a fate that had marked him for death before he'd even set foot on this cursed world. And with each passing hour, the debt grew larger. The interest compounded, until he began to understand that survival wasn't a blessing. It was a form of prolonged torture, a cosmic joke played by entities whose sense of humor was calibrated to cause maximum suffering. But he was still alive. Against all odds, against all statistical probability, against the very laws of warfare that governed the 41st Millennium, Arvin L. was still breathing, still fighting, still carrying out the Emperor's will in this forgotten corner of hell. The clock was still ticking, but he was beginning to suspect that it might be broken. Hour 29 brought a revelation that changed everything Arvin thought he understood about war, death, and the fundamental nature of the universe he'd been born into. It started with the silence, not the complete absence of sound. Brcher Rock would never know true quiet as long as human and orc forces shared its poisoned air, but the sudden cessation of the constant background noise that had become the soundtrack to his extended survival. The random artillery fire that punctuated every conversation, the distant rumble of armored vehicles moving through the ruins, the screams that echoed across no man's land at irregular intervals. Some human, some orc, some from creatures that defied easy classification. All of it stopped at once, as if someone had thrown a switch marked war and turned it to the off position. Sergeant Vex was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. "This is wrong," she said, her scarred face turning toward the sky as if expecting to see some cosmic explanation written in the blood-colored clouds. "They don't just stop. Orcs don't take breaks. They don't pause for tactical consultation. They fight until they die or until there's nothing left to fight." The eerie quiet stretched for exactly 17 minutes. Arvin found himself counting automatically, his mind clinging to measurable time as the only constant in a reality that seemed increasingly untethered from natural law. Then the horizon erupted in green fire. Not the crude explosions of orc artillery, but something else entirely. Pillars of sickly light that reached from the planet's surface to its upper atmosphere, pulsing with a rhythm that was almost organic. As Arvin watched, transfixed, the pillars began to move, sweeping across the landscape like the searchlights of some impossibly vast predator. "Wah, magic," whispered Private Kovar, her voice barely audible over the growing hum that seemed to emanate from the planet itself. "They're not just fighting us anymore. They're changing the rules." The first wave of the new assault began 37 minutes into Arvin's statistical impossibility. But these weren't the same orcs that had been testing the Imperial lines for days. These were something evolved, something that had been touched by the same green fire that still painted the horizon in shades of nightmare. They moved with purpose instead of random aggression, their weapons glowing with the same eldritch energy that had transformed them from mere Xenos into something approaching a force of nature. Arvin's laser gun felt pathetically inadequate as he watched creatures the size of battle tanks charge toward their position with speed that defied physics. His weapon, blessed by tech priests, sanctified with sacred oils, inscribed with litanies of accuracy, might as well have been a child's toy for all the effect it had on targets that seemed to absorb last fire and convert it into fuel for their own unholy vitality. "Aim for the eyes!" Sergeant Vex shouted, though her voice sounded thin and desperate against the roar of the approaching horde. "If that doesn't work, aim for the joints. If that doesn't work, pray to the Emperor and die like a guardsman." The battle that followed transcended everything Arvin had experienced in his previous 29 hours of combat. This wasn't warfare. It was a lesson in applied hopelessness, a masterclass in the fundamental inadequacy of human ambition when confronted with forces that operated according to different physical laws. He watched a Mordian veteran with 40 years of service empty an entire power cell into an orc that continued charging even after most of its internal organs had been vaporized. He saw a heavy weapons team score a direct hit with a missile launcher, only to have their target emerge from the explosion larger and more dangerous than before. Most terrifyingly, he witnessed the moment when Private Kepler, a young man who'd arrived on the same transport as Arvin, was touched by one of the green energy fields and began to change, his human features sliding into something that was neither orc nor human, but somehow worse than either. Yet somehow, impossibly, Arvin continued to live. Last rounds passed close enough to his head to singe his hair. Explosions threw him into shell craters that should have become his grave. Orc weapons that could have reduced him to his component atoms missed by margins measured in millimeters rather than meters. It was Kovar who finally put words to what they were all thinking, as they crouched in the ruins of what had once been a command bunker, covered in the blood of friends and enemies alike. "You're cursed, farm boy," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of awe and terror, that was distinctly unsettling. "Not blessed. Cursed. The Emperor's keeping you alive to watch the rest of us die. You're his witness, his chronicler, his living testament to how completely fucked we all are." The words hit Arvin like a physical blow, not because they were cruel, but because they made sense. Every impossible survival, every near miss that should have been a direct hit, every moment when death had reached for him only to inexplicably pause. It all formed a pattern that was too deliberate to be coincidence. He wasn't surviving through skill or luck or divine favor. He was being preserved, maintained in a state of functional horror for reasons that no mortal mind could comprehend. He was a walking reminder that fate could be worse than death, that sometimes the universe's greatest cruelties were disguised as mercy. As the 36th hour of his impossible existence began, Arvin looked around at the handful of soldiers who still drew breath in their small section of hell. 5 faces, including his own, illuminated by the green fire that continued to dance across Brcher Rock's tortured sky. 5 witnesses to humanity's latest defeat in its endless war against the darkness. But he was still alive, still breathing, still counting the minutes on a clock that should have stopped ticking more than a day ago. The Emperor's greatest joke wasn't that he had abandoned humanity to fight alone against impossible odds. It was that sometimes he forced them to live long enough to understand exactly how hopeless their situation truly was. The sunrise of Arvin's second day on Brcher Rock painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson that would have been beautiful on any world not currently serving as a casualty processing center for the galaxy's most creative forms of violence. He watched it creep over the horizon from his position in what had once been a medici station and was now just another hole in the ground where people came to die with slightly more dignity than usual. 38 hours. He'd been breathing for 38 hours in a place where the average life expectancy was measured in fractions of a single day. The mathematical impossibility of his continued existence had moved beyond miracle territory and into the realm of cosmic horror. He was no longer a soldier. He was a walking violation of natural law, a flesh-and-blood proof that the universe had a sense of humor that bordered on the pathological. The medici station held 4 other survivors from various units that had been ground to nothing by the night's fighting. Sister Carmina, an Adepta Sororitas, whose power armor had been so thoroughly destroyed that she was now indistinguishable from a regular guardsman, except for the way she whispered prayers with the fervor of someone who'd actually seen the Emperor's angels in combat. Trooper Hecht, whose aumetic legs had carried him through minefields that should have reduced him to vapor. Corporal Yanez, who'd somehow survived the complete destruction of his Chimera transport by being thrown clear at exactly the right angle to avoid both the explosion and the subsequent ammunition cook-off. And Vex, still alive despite having accumulated enough injuries over the past day and a half to kill a small squad, still functional, despite having witnessed horrors that would have driven a lesser mind into the comfortable embrace of catatonia. They shared their meager rations in silence, each lost in thoughts too dark and too personal to voice. The food, if the processed protein paste deserved such a dignified name, tasted like cardboard mixed with industrial lubricant, but it was calories, and calories meant continued function, and continued function meant the possibility of seeing another impossible sunrise. "I've been thinking," said Hecht eventually, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of renewed fighting, "about the 15-hour rule, about what it really means." He paused to take another spoonful of the gray paste that served as breakfast, chewing thoughtfully before continuing. "It's not just a survival statistic. It's a psychological weapon. They tell us we're going to die in 15 hours, so we'll fight with the desperation of the already dead. No conservation of ammunition, no tactical withdrawal, no surrender negotiations. Just pure, distilled expenditure of human resources until the objective is achieved or everyone stops breathing. Sister Carmina looked up from her own rations, her eyes holding the kind of brightness that came from extended exposure to combat stimulants and religious fervor. The Emperor tests us all according to our capacity to serve. Some serve for 15 hours. Others serve for 15 years. The duration is irrelevant. Only the purity of service matters. Easy for you to say, Vex interjected with the kind of bitter humor that kept veteran soldiers functional in the face of statistical impossibility. Your service contract includes resurrection guarantees and a pension plan that extends into the afterlife. The rest of us just get recycled into corpse starch and motivational posters. Arvin found himself thinking about his mother's letters, safely stored in his kit until the explosion that had destroyed his previous position, along with most of his personal possessions. She'd written about the harvest, about the neighbors' children, about the small dramas and victories that comprised life on a peaceful agri-world. Her handwriting had been careful and precise, each word chosen to convey love and hope across the impossible distance that separated them. Those letters were gone now, reduced to ash and memory by the same forces that had killed 3/4 of his regiment. But the words remained, burning in his mind like brands. Come home safe, my dear boy. The Emperor protects those who serve with pure hearts. Pure hearts. As if purity of intent could deflect las fire or sanctity of purpose could stop an orc power claw from removing his head from his shoulders. As if the Emperor, sitting immobile on his golden throne for 10,000 years, had time to monitor the cardiac condition of every soldier in his vast armies. But perhaps she'd been right in ways she couldn't have understood. Perhaps purity of heart wasn't about avoiding death. Perhaps it was about accepting death so completely that its absence became a form of spiritual punishment rather than divine blessing. The attack came at 1100 hours local time, heralded by the now familiar sound of orc aircraft screaming through the poisoned atmosphere like mechanized banshees. But this wasn't another probe or testing assault. This was something final, a concentrated effort to eliminate the handful of humans who'd had the audacity to survive longer than the tactical projections suggested. Arvin took his position behind the ruins of a wall that had once protected patients recovering from minor injuries. Now, it served as the last barrier between 5 impossible survivors and an enemy force that had grown tired of playing with its food. His laser gun felt familiar in his hands now, its weight and balance as natural as breathing. Its machine spirit singing hymns of accuracy that he could feel in his bones. The orcs came in waves, each one larger and more organized than the last. But something had changed in the way they moved, the way they fought, the way they died. They no longer attacked with the random ferocity that had characterized their previous assaults. These creatures moved with purpose, with tactical intelligence, with something approaching military discipline. Arvin put a last round through the eye of an orc that was coordinating sniper fire from a position 300 meters away. The shot was perfect, a testament to months of training and 38 hours of practical application, and the target dropped immediately. But as it fell, another orc immediately took its position, continuing the same tactical coordination without missing a beat. They were learning. Not just individually, but collectively, the entire orc force sharing information and adapting strategies in real time. What had begun as a simple extermination mission was evolving into something that resembled actual warfare, with all the terrible implications that carried for the handful of humans still breathing on this forgotten rock. The battle lasted 6 hours. When it was over, Sister Carmina was gone, her last words a prayer to saints whose names had been forgotten before the first human set foot on Brcher Rock. Hecht had fallen when his augmetic legs finally failed, their power cells drained by the constant movement required to stay ahead of ork artillery. Yanez had simply vanished during one of the many retreats that had characterized the afternoon's fighting, leaving behind only a blood-spattered helmet and the kind of silence that spoke louder than screams. Vex and Arvin crouched in the ruins of the Medici station as the system's sun began its descent toward another poisoned horizon. 44 hours. He'd been alive for 44 hours in a place where existence itself was a statistical anomaly. "Still breathing, farm boy?" Vex asked, her voice hoarse from shouting orders that no one had been left alive to follow. "Still breathing?" he confirmed, though the words felt strange in his mouth. He was no longer surprised by his survival. He'd moved beyond surprise into a realm of numb acceptance that bordered on enlightenment. He was alive because the universe required him to be alive, for reasons that mortal minds weren't equipped to understand. "Good," she said, and her smile was the saddest thing he'd ever seen. "Someone needs to remember this. Someone needs to witness what happened here, what we tried to do, what we died for. The Emperor may not be listening, but maybe someone else is." As the first stars became visible through the chemical haze that served as Brcher Rock's atmosphere, Arvin settled in for another night of impossible survival. The clock was still ticking, but he'd stopped trying to predict when it might finally stop. Some jokes, he'd learned, had very long punchlines. The 47th hour brought a gift that Arvin hadn't dared to hope for: reinforcements. They came down through the poisoned atmosphere in drop pods that screamed like damned souls, their hulls glowing white-hot from atmospheric friction and enemy fire alike. But these weren't the crude transports that had carried Arvin and his doomed regiment to their statistical deaths. These were Astartes' insertion craft, bearing the crimson and gold livery of the Imperial fists, and their very presence transformed the strategic calculus of Brcher Rock from hopeless last stand to genuine military operation. Arvin watched from his position in the ruins as 8-foot-tall demigods in powered armor deployed with the fluid precision of a training exercise. Their movements were economical, purposeful, carrying none of the desperate energy that characterized mortal soldiers fighting for their lives. These were the Emperor's angels of death, and they had come to demonstrate why humanity ruled the galaxy despite being individually inferior to most of its enemies. The first Astartes to reach their position moved like liquid metal poured into human form. His bolter tracking targets with mechanical precision, while his Vox grill issued tactical updates in a voice that could have been carved from granite. The kill markings on his armor spoke of campaigns that spanned centuries, of enemies that existed only in the nightmares of military historians. "Imperial Guard survivors, identify yourselves," he commanded. And even though his voice was filtered through multiple layers of technology, it carried an authority that made Arvin's bones vibrate in sympathetic resonance. "Sergeant Vex, 47th Mordian Iron Guard," she replied, snapping to attention with parade ground precision, despite the fact that her uniform was held together by equal parts determination and dried blood. "One other survivor, sir. Trooper Arvin L., attached from Cadian training facilities. The Space Marine's helmet turned toward Arvin with mechanical smoothness, and he felt the weight of sensors more sophisticated than anything in the guard's arsenal, analyzing everything from his heart rate to the chemical composition of his sweat. 47-hour survival time in active combat zone, the Astartes observed, his tone carrying a note of what might have been approval. Exceptional performance, trooper. Exceptional performance. The words should have filled Arvin with pride, with a sense of accomplishment that would have sustained him through whatever fresh hells awaited. Instead, they felt like an epitaph written for someone who wasn't quite dead yet, a premature eulogy for a statistical anomaly that was still breathing despite all evidence suggesting otherwise. "Sir," Arvin replied, because speaking was easier than thinking about the implications of being noticed by beings whose very existence was proof that humanity could transcend its limitations when it applied sufficient will and engineering expertise. The Astartes' assault on the ork positions was a masterpiece of applied violence that redefined Arvin's understanding of what warfare could accomplish when prosecuted by individuals who had been designed from the genetic level upward to excel at killing things. They moved through enemy strongpoints like antibodies through an infected bloodstream, each engagement lasting exactly as long as necessary to eliminate all Xeno's presence, and not 1 second longer. But even watching gods of war demonstrate their craft couldn't entirely distract Arvin from the growing certainty that his impossible survival was approaching some kind of crescendo. 47 hours of life in a place where death was the only reliable constant suggested that the universe was building toward something, some revelation, or catastrophe, or cosmic punchline that would justify the elaborate setup of his extended existence. The answer came at sunset on his second day, delivered by an ork warlord the size of a Baneblade tank, and roughly half as intelligent. The creature had emerged from some deep tunnel system that honeycombed Brcher Rock's interior, leading a horde of followers whose weapons glowed with the same eldritch energy that had transformed the previous night's assault into something approaching a religious experience. The Space Marines engaged immediately, their bolters and flamers carving swaths through the greenskin horde with the methodical efficiency of industrial equipment. But the warlord was different. Touched by whatever power had been awakening in the depths of the planet, armored in plates that seemed to absorb energy rather than merely deflecting it. Arvin watched Brother Sergeant Maximilian, 800 years of combat experience distilled into a form that could bench press a Rhino transport, empty an entire magazine of mass-reactive rounds into the creature's center mass. The bolts detonated with precision timing, each explosion calculated to cause maximum tissue damage to a target of that approximate size and composition. The warlord laughed, a sound like continents grinding together, and backhanded the Space Marine hard enough to embed him in the wall of a reinforced bunker. That was when Arvin understood his purpose, the reason he'd been preserved through 47 hours of statistical impossibility. Not to survive. Survival had never been the point. He'd been kept alive to witness this moment, to see the instant when humanity's greatest warriors proved insufficient against the enemies that waited in the darkness between the stars. The warlord's gaze fell on him, and in those eyes, larger than dinner plates, glowing with alien intelligence and cruel amusement, Arvin saw his own reflection. A small, fragile human clutching a weapon that couldn't penetrate even standard ork armor, standing in the ruins of his species' latest failed attempt to impose order on a universe that had no interest in being ordered. "Little Yumi," the warlord rumbled, its voice carrying harmonics that made Arvin's teeth ache. "You been watching the whole show, ain't ya? Seen all your friends get chopped up? Seen the big homies get smashed down. Seen how this story ends. Arvin raised his laser gun, knowing that the gesture was meaningless, but needing to make it anyway. 47 hours of impossible survival had taught him that some acts were worth performing regardless of their practical outcome. "Yeah," he said, and his voice was steadier than it had any right to be. "I've seen how it ends. Question is, are you going to get there before the sun comes up?" The warlord's laughter shook dust from the rubble around them. "Little Yumi got some fight left. That's good. Makes the killing more fun." But as the creature raised its massive weapon, a device that looked like someone had crossbred a cannon with a chainsaw and added decorative skulls as a design accent, something unexpected happened. The eastern horizon began to glow with the first light of Brcher Rock's third dawn since Arvin's arrival, and with that light came a sound that made even the orc warlord pause. The deep, harmonious chanting of 1,000 space marines, their voices raised in the battle hymns of the Great Crusade, the thunder of drop pods and the scream of fighters descending through the atmosphere, the mechanical roar of tanks and walkers and artillery pieces that had been blessed by tech priests, who understood that war was the purest form of prayer. A full Astartes strike force, supported by guard regiments from a dozen worlds, accompanied by Adeptus Mechanicus battle servitors and Adepta Sororitas warriors whose faith burned brighter than plasma fire. The reinforcements that Arvin had never allowed himself to hope for, arriving at the exact moment when hope itself had become a liability. 48 hours. He'd lived for 48 hours in the worst war zone in Imperial space. And now, he was going to see the sun rise on a day that would actually belong to humanity rather than the green tide that had claimed this rock for far too long. The Emperor's clock was still ticking, but for the first time since he'd arrived on Brcher Rock, Arvin began to believe that he might actually hear it tick again tomorrow. The universe, Arvin discovered, had saved its cruelest joke for last. The Imperial reinforcements swept across Brcher Rock like a cleansing fire, their combined might driving the orc forces back into the deep tunnel systems where they could be systematically eliminated by teams of specialists trained in underground warfare. The green tide that had claimed so many lives was finally receding, leaving behind a scarred landscape that would take decades to fully heal, but would stand as testament to humanity's refusal to yield even the smallest piece of ground to Xenos' ambition. Arvin found himself assigned to a casualty collection team, his 48 hours of survival marking him as someone with enough experience to navigate the battlefield without getting himself killed in the process. It was grim work. Identifying bodies, recovering equipment, marking locations where the dead lay too deep in rubble to be easily retrieved, but it felt almost peaceful compared to the constant terror of active combat. He was working his way through the ruins of what had once been a Chimera transport when he found Sergeant Holst. The scarred veteran was propped against a piece of twisted metal, his augmetic eye dark, his breathing shallow, but steady. Somehow, impossibly, the man who'd shared stories during the long voyage to Brcher Rock was still alive. "Farm boy," Holst wheezed, his voice barely audible over the distant sound of mop-up operations. "Should have known you'd make it." Too stupid to die properly. Arvin knelt beside the wounded sergeant, checking his injuries with the basic medical training that all guardsmen received. Multiple las burns, what looked like shrapnel wounds from an orc grenade, and internal injuries that were probably beyond field treatment. But he was conscious, alert, and talking, which was more than could be said for most of the casualties being brought in. "How long have you been here?" Arvin asked, breaking out his medical supplies and beginning the process of stabilizing wounds that should have killed their victim hours ago. "Since the first day?" Holst replied, his scarred face twisting into something that might have been a smile. Took shrapnel in the drop, crawled into this hole, been watching the war go by ever since. Saw you run past a dozen times, always figured you'd get yourself killed before the day was out. 48 hours. Both of them had survived 48 hours in a war zone where the average life expectancy was measured in fractions of a single day. Two statistical impossibilities defying the cold mathematics of industrial warfare through nothing more than random chance and stubborn refusal to stop breathing. "Medic!" Arvin called, his voice carrying across the ruins with the authority of someone who'd learned to make himself heard over the sound of artillery bombardment. "Wounded guardsman here!" Still functional. The medic who responded was a young woman whose Red Cross armband was stained with the blood of 100 previous patients. She took one look at Holosen's injuries, ran a scanner over his vital signs, and shook her head with professional finality. "I can make him comfortable," she said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of experience with battlefield triage decisions. "But he's got maybe an hour, two at the outside. Internal bleeding, organ damage, probably some neural disruption from the augmetic failure." "I'm sorry." Holst laughed, a sound like grinding metal that nonetheless held genuine amusement. 50 hours, he said, his augmetic eye flickering to life for a moment before dying again. 50 hours in the worst posting in the galaxy, and I'm going to die of wounds I took on the first day. There's some kind of poetry in that, don't you think? Arvin stayed with him as the sun climbed toward its zenith, sharing water from his canteen and listening to stories about battles fought on worlds whose names had been forgotten by everyone except the men who'd bled for them. Holst talked about Armageddon and Vrax and Cadia before its fall, painting pictures of warfare on a scale that made Brcher Rock look like a minor skirmish between rival hive gangs. "The thing about this job," Holst said as his breathing grew more labored, "is that it never really ends. You die, and someone else takes your place, and the war goes on without missing a beat. The only victory is knowing that you held the line long enough for the next poor bastard to pick up where you left off." He died at exactly 50 hours and 17 minutes. His last words a prayer to the Emperor that trailed off into silence as his augmetic heart finally gave up its struggle against the inevitable. Arvin closed the old soldier's eyes and added his name to the growing list of casualties that would be transmitted back to Departamento Munitorum statisticians who would use his death to refine their calculations about survival rates in active combat zones. 50 hours and 17 minutes. A new record for the Brcher Rock deployment, though it was unlikely that anyone would celebrate the achievement. Arvin was walking back toward the casualty collection point when the sniper's round found him. It was a perfect shot, the kind that sniper instructors used as examples when teaching marksmanship to new recruits. The last beam took him high in the chest, missing his heart by millimeters, but finding the major artery that would ensure he bled out quickly enough to avoid prolonged suffering. He felt the impact like a punch from an angry god, followed by the spreading warmth that meant his body was beginning the process of shutting down non-essential functions. He fell backward into a shell crater that was half filled with stagnant water, his vision already beginning to tunnel as shock and blood loss combined to drag him toward unconsciousness. Above him, Brcher Rock's poisoned sky was beginning to clear for the first time in months, revealing stars that had been hidden by smoke and chemical haze since the siege began. 51 hours and 43 minutes. He'd survived longer than anyone had thought possible, witnessed the impossible, and lived to see humanity's victory snatched from the jaws of certain defeat. He'd beaten the odds, defied the statistics, and proved that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe's sense of humor included the occasional happy ending. The orc sniper that had killed him was eliminated 30 seconds later by a Space Marine scout whose bolt round removed the creature's head with surgical precision. But by then, Arvin was already gone. His last thought a flash of gratitude that he'd lived long enough to see one more sunrise on a world that had never been meant for human habitation. The Emperor's clock had finally stopped ticking, but it had run far longer than anyone had dared to hope. In the casualty reports filed that evening, Trooper Arvin L. was listed as having survived 51 hours and 43 minutes in active combat on Brcher Rock, establishing a new record that would stand until the next impossible soldier managed to live even longer than the mathematics of war suggested was possible. His name was entered into the regimental records with a note about his exceptional service, and then promptly forgotten by everyone except the statisticians, who used his death to update their survival projections for future deployments. The war went on, as wars always do, sustained by the blood of heroes whose names would never be remembered and whose sacrifices would never be fully understood by the people they died to protect. But for 51 hours and 43 minutes, one farm boy from Helios 7 had proven that sometimes, just sometimes, the universe's cruelest jokes could have unexpectedly merciful punchlines. The Emperor's clock had stopped, but somewhere in the ruins of Brcher Rock, another chronometer was already beginning to tick,